Thanks for joining us for another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum where all voices matter. Is Canada ready for the new national security challenges of the future? Our next guest has examined the future of war and is not convinced. Please welcome Richard Shimooka. He is a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Welcome back to the program, Richard.
Thanks for having me.
So, what do you mean when you write that the future of war is changing?
So I think you have to look at warfare in general over the past decade here and actually look a bit how society's changed as well. So we see basically we have smartphones, social networking, a huge amount of data being utilized in order to make decision making, and the militaries are changing in similar ways. So you have obviously we have sort of tanks and aircraft, and the performance of those systems, they're increasing, not very much, but they're increasing slightly. What's really changed in the past decade has been the ability to sort of network different capabilities together and operate in a really synergistic fashion. In many ways, just as like everybody's daily lives have changed, that with smartphones telling us where to go with sort of real-time maps, or with traffic updates, or communicating with people and doing sort of jobs that are quickly sort of identified. Somebody might call in, I need a job here, and then somebody's dispatched very quickly, just like Amazon. Militaries are changing in the exact same way, and that reality is sort of really driven a lot of technological change in the past decade here among sort of our allies, and unfortunately to a lesser extent the Canadian Armed Forces.
Yeah, we'll talk about that. I just want to get a sense of this rate of change and some of the drivers of change, and talk a little bit about the war in/on Ukraine. Obviously, the terrible death and destruction should be first and foremost for driving our policy choices and so on to try to end that. But there's also, I'm sure, a lot of watchers in various military looking at about how war has in fact changed when you're looking at that conflict. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely. And I think it's actually really interesting to see this because starting off, where the war in Ukraine didn't just start in 2020, or sorry, last year, excuse me.
Yeah.
It started way back in 2014, and you started to see a lot of these adaptations start. So one of the interesting things is that the Ukrainians pretty quickly started using cell phones to sort of, let's say, using their artillery systems and using smartphones to sort of calculate where they're going to hit, to use them to actually call in ground strikes, and to sort of really increase the sort of the speed at which the military operations occurred much more rapidly. Excuse me. So it started to occur there. You saw drones being used in really sort of unique and quick ways. That you saw drones being used not just to sort of attack targets, but to provide persistent coverage over areas, to identify where troop concentrations may be happening, calling in strikes, moving troops around. You saw cyber warfare is another aspect of this. That's one of the actually really interesting parts, is that Ukraine's kind of showed us that there's many different places where warfare has changed. It's not just, as I was talking about information warfare, but it's also cyber. You see the drones. You see so many different areas sort of be affected by the very much the change
satellites.
Absolutely, satellites. It's in almost every area of warfare. Aspects have changed dramatically over the past decade. Again, just like in our daily lives that we see today.
So we've got about a minute before the break. So this might be a two-parter, but let's discuss Canada now. Canada needs to modernize. What have they been doing? First of all, what has Canada been doing to modernize its national armed forces, and how effective has that been?
Yeah, so we have to go back to 2017 with Strong, Secure, and Engage, which is the existing defense policy. There's an update coming, which is almost certainly going to update a lot of these areas. But Canada kind of approached this in a much more sort of traditional fashion, where they looked at sort of big, heavy capabilities, like we're going to need new ships, we're going to need new patrol aircraft, et cetera, and so forth. And whereas a lot of these changes are very sort of from the ground up, they're grassroots sort of systems increases that sort of tie in a lot of capabilities. They're not really sexy, for lack of a better word, because a lot of it's just programming and sort of building the interconnected tissue. But we've kind of been trying to sort of update our big, heavy systems, and that's only half of the story that needs to be addressed.
Okay, so we're going to continue on this line of conversation, but we're going to take a brief break with our guest, Richard Shimooka. Please stay with us. We'll be right back.